Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Metzia daf Kuf. Today's daf is sponsored by Leslie Glassberg Nadell in loving memory of her mother, Teresa Glassberg, Tova Bat Tzvi Hirsch Bela on her 20th year at site on Rosh Chodesh Sivan. May her memory be for a blessing. Chodesh Tov to everyone, and we are going to get started with the top of our daf. New case. Mishna. Hamachliv para b'chamor v'yalda, v'chein hamocher shivchato v'yalda. If somebody does a trade, okay, we trade my cow for your donkey, or mocher shivchato, or I sell you a slave woman. So let's say I'm the one giving you the cow, or I'm the one selling you the slave. And now the slave gives birth at some point. We're not sure when, or the cow gives birth. Okay, a little bit of an unpleasant comparison, animals and slaves, but we're just talking that legally there's something similar about them. Zeh omer, if we don't even talk about, which we've brought up already, the whole selling of slaves, which is difficult for us to swallow in the first place, but in any case, each one claims that the offspring was born when it was in their domain. So I claim it was before I sold it to you, and you claim it was after I sold it to you. And then if it was after, it's yours. If it was before, it's obviously mine because all I sold you was the slave. The offspring was born already. I didn't sell you the offspring. Yachloku, we split it 50-50. Case 2. There's two slaves I have. One is large, one is small. I have two fields. One is large, one is small. And now we have a big debate about which one you purchased. Okay, I haven't given it to you yet. We're now going to have the 4 permutations we had last time. Okay, if you remember, 2 Mishnayot ago, which is, if you're definitive in your claim, you say, I know I bought the larger one. And I say, I don't really remember. You get the larger animal. You get the larger slave or field. If I say, I know I sold you the small one, and you say, I don't know, then all you get is the small one. This is the classic bari, shema, bari, adif. If one has a definitive claim and one has a claim that's, I don't know, then we go by the definitive claim. What if we're both sure about our answers? Then the seller takes the oath and only gives, this is the classic also, who takes the oath? The one who doesn't have to pay. In this case, it's just pay less, right? So the least things are moved as possible because they at least all agree that it's a small one, and the mocher has to take an oath. We're going to have to figure out why an oath in this case. Why is this different than first case we started with today? There we have this debate. You say it was after I bought it. I say it was before you bought it. It was born. And what do we say? We split it 50-50. In this case, we take an oath. Why? Is it not the same case? So we're going to have to deal with that. If neither of us are sure, then we just split it 50-50. Perhaps, and this is something we're going to deal with later, the first case of our Mishnah is the same as the last case. And the first case is when it says, maybe it means, I thought it was, maybe it was before I sold it. And you say, maybe it was after I bought it. So perhaps it's a shema, we don't know. There's something just strange, and I just want to point this out about the structure of the Mishnayot. 2 Mishnayot ago, we had these cases also, where we had, remember, the 3 cases of the half schirut, half all that. And then we had all these 4 permutations. Then the reason why they put this other Mishnah in the middle was we had to deal with this issue of when does a person stop, right? When are they chayav in the onsim? When we were talking about the shoel and all that because it connected with the shoel. Now we're going back to that and doing the bari and shema and all those 4 claims. It's the exact parallel to that Mishnah. Why case number 1 doesn't go into detail about this is a good question. The structure of our Mishnah is a little strange. We have one case where we just say we split it 50-50, and it's actually not even clear, is it bari and bari, is it shema or shema? Then we go to the second case, and there we have all the 4 permutations. So not clear why the Mishnah didn't give all the 4 permutations in case 1, but that's just, I'm putting it out there as a bit of a strange structure with the Mishnayot. The first question of the Gemara is going to be on case number 1. And I'll just point out, I'm not going to get into the details, Rabbanit Shimoni Shiur should be up on our site already, about Drara de Mamona, which basically is the response of Rashi, and this big machlok Rashi Tosfot about this, how this Mishnah compares to the Mishnah in the beginning of Bava Metzia with the 2 people in the Talit. And why is it not the same? And that's really something that we don't have time for right now in class, but that's why we have extra shiurim on the website to be able to delve into these other things, which really grapple with the bigger picture and how do all these sugyot connect with each other? How do we reconcile the differences? So for that, I recommend you listen to Gefet, and we're going to get started. Amai yachloku. So why do we do yachloku here? So again, I sold you a para for a chamor. It doesn't, some people say it matters that it's specifically chalipin. We're not going to get into that either. Chalipin is when we do a barter. Or I sold you a slave. And now we have a debate of a slave woman. We have a debate because the cow or the slave woman gave birth and we don't know when. So why yachloku? Why don't we use our classic rules of chezkat mamon? Wherever the money is, we don't take out money unless you have proof. The one who wants to take money from the other should have the burden of proof is on them. So why don't we just see in whose domain is it right now? So if the offspring, where's that baby right now? Is the baby in your hands or is it in my hands? Why don't we just see and say, okay, well, if the other person wants to get the baby back or get the baby to them, they have to prove it. So we're going to say, Amar Rabbi Chiya bar Av and Amar Shmuel, the case must be, according to Shmuel, be'omed pa'agam or shivchanam edekayim b'simta. It's a case where the offspring and the slave is, and slave with its offspring, the animal with its offspring is either the animals in the marsh, the slave woman is in an alleyway. In other words, they're not in either of our domains. They're in a public space that doesn't belong to anybody. Okay, and that must be the case because if it was, regular laws would kick in. Sorry, I skipped that. Okay, nukma achezkat marikama. If it's in the agam or the simta and it's in no man's land, well, it still should be in someone's possession because where does it have presumptive ownership? Where is the last place we knew it to be? And let's go with that. There's another principle, which is wherever the last presumptive ownership was, the chazaka, let's go with that, which means who? The seller. Because the last place we knew this cow to be, or slave to be, was at the seller's possession. So nukma achezkat marakama. Marakama is the original owner. And then the burden of proof should be on you, the buyer. So to which they answer, fine, you're right. We can't explain this is classic. You'd have to explain, Ha'amane, who does this go according to? This might be sounding familiar already by now. Hopefully it is. This is just classic Sumchus. Sumchus doesn't believe in Hamotzi Mechaber Alav Haraya. In certain cases, yes, but usually if we have a doubt about the money, Sumchus says split it 50-50. Now we're going to have a bit of a deliberation about in which case does Sumchus say this. But first, let's explain. So now they say, okay, so basically our Mishna is Sumchus. I say it was born by me. You say it was born by you. We split it. What's the problem? Well, the problem is, Imur Damar Sumchus b'shema v'shema. Sumchus, when he says, Mamonu b'tava safeh, hokim, without a shvua, without, no side needs to take an oath, that's in a case where nobody's really sure. We have no idea. We don't know when this offspring was born, let's say. That's when Sumchus would say it, but that's not the case in our Mishnah. Well, we don't know, but right now we're going to assume that's not the case in our Mishnah, because what does our Mishnah say? I say it was before it was sold. You say it was after I bought it. That sounds like definitive claims. Bari mi amar, did Sumchus say also we split a 50-50 when each one has a very definitive stance? Okay, and there's reason to think that we wouldn't say it there, okay? Because if we don't know and neither one really knows, it makes a lot of sense, let's split a 50-50. But if I'm sure I'm right and you're sure you're right, split a 50-50 might not be the right way to go because someone is clearly lying, right? Well, we each say we don't know, so nobody's lying. Nobody's trying to take something out of anyone's hands. They're just saying maybe it's mine, maybe it's mine. And then it's obvious we split 50-50. But if one is definitive and the other is very definitive, maybe splitting is not the right answer. So now we're going to learn that there's machloket. Remember, Sumchus is a Tana, and the Amoreim who came generations later were trying to figure out what Sumchus really held. So we're going to have a debate about whether he said it bari or not. Amar Raba bar Rav Huna, yes, in fact, yes. And we're going to quote this line all the time, so every time you see the in, you'll understand. In is a reference to this question. Did Sumchus really say it in bari? And to which Rabbi Rav Huna says yes. Amar Sumchus afilu bebari ubari. Yes, Sumchus said yachloku, even if we both have definitive claims. And that's how he explains the Mishnah. So now we have a simple explanation to the Mishnah. Even in bari, Sumchus says yachloku, and therefore the first line of the Mishnah is Sumchus. Rava Amar lo olam ki amar Sumchus shema v'shema. Of a bari lo amar. Rava says no way, no how. Sumchus only said what he meant in a suffix case, where each one has a non-definitive claim. Utnei, and you have to read the Mishnah like this. Ze omer shema ad shalom acharti. Ze omer shema mishalakachti. You have to add the word shema. Perhaps. This one said, I said it, perhaps it was before it was sold. And you say, perhaps it was after I bought it. So that is how Raba would have to explain the Mishnah. Then the Mishnah is Sumchus, and the case is a shema v'shema. Now we're going to try to see if there's a problem. We're going to raise two problems with Rabba bar Rav Huna, okay? And both from our Mishnah. First from first part of our Mishnah, and then from the second part of our Mishnah. Tanan. Ze omer, Tanan means we're quoting from our Mishnah. Ze omer eni, Tanan means we're quoting a Mishnah, but in this case, we happen to be quoting from our Mishnah. Ze omer eni yodea, v'ze omer eni yodea, yachloku. Now, it says at the end of our Mishnah, sorry, my mistake. We're quoting also from the end of our Mishnah. This is the last line of the Mishnah. The last line of the Mishnah, so remember, the Mishnah has two parts. First part about the shivcha, there's only one case given there, and our whole question is it shema v'shema or is it bari ubari? Then we have the second case, which is two fields or two slaves. I sold you one, right? But we don't know which one. You claim the bigger, I obviously claim the smaller. And we have four options of who is bari, who is shema. The last case is the shema v'shema case. And what's the ruling? Yachloku. We split it 50-50. It's the only case where we say yachloku in a shema v'shema. So this is going to be a good proof for Rava, because then we're going to say, oh, it makes sense if there's yachloku in the beginning. It must be parallel to the yachloku at the end, right? That the only case there, when you give all the four options of yachloku is shema v'shema, then the resha must be also shema v'shema. So let's read it inside. Okay, it makes sense. The end is shema v'shema. The beginning also, again, it's not just because it's just because the ruling is the same. In the bari case, in the second case, you have an oath. You don't have that in the top case. But Ella Raba bar Rav Huna, and here they're going to even further prove why it doesn't make sense it would be bari or bari, because the Raba bar Rav Huna damar in Amar Sumchus afilu bari. That's the quote. Yes, Sumchus did say even in a bari case. That was just what Raba bar Rav Huna said. If you start the Mishnah, now let's just read the Mishnah according to his reading. You start the Mishnah and you say, if each side is very strong in their claim, and what does Sumchus say? We split it 50-50. So hashta bari amar yachloku, we're going to split it. Shema v'shema bebaya. Why do you need to bring the end of the Mishnah? Why do you need to tell me that if we both come with maybe it's mine, I don't know, of course you're going to split it 50-50, right? Because the whole logic is, even if you say it's both, but it's definitely more intuitive to split it 50-50 when neither of us know. So you would have no need for the last line in the Mishnah. It would be obvious from the first line. To which the Gemara says, Imishum halo iria, that's not a question against Rabbi Rav Huna, because you could say, Tana sefa legaluye resha. The reason it told you the last case is shema v'shema, so that you'd understand that the first case is obviously different. Because if there's no need for it, the need is to explain to you that case number one is a bari ubari. Shelo tomar, don't think, if we didn't have the last case, what might you think? When it said yachloku in the first case, you would have thought maybe that's shema v'shema. Resha shema v'shema, aval bari ubari lo. And then you think if each one has a definitive claim, you don't split it 50-50. And therefore, Tana Seifa Shema V'Shema Michal Deresha Bari Ubari. This is the exact opposite logic of Raba, and this teaches you, as we know in the Gemara, you can prove almost anything logically. If you didn't have the last case, and you only had the first case that said Yachloku, we'd assume that since it's more intuitive to say Yachloku and Shema V'Shema, we'll say the first case is Shema V'Shema, like Rava thought to say it was. Now, Rava thought to say it was because the last case was Shema V'Shema, and it's the same law, so let's just assume it's the same thing. This is saying exactly the opposite. If you didn't have the last case, you'd assume the first case was Shema V'Shema. So why do you have the last case? To teach you that it's different from the first case. The last case is Shema V'Shema, but the first case is bari ubari. So even though you might say once you have bari ubari, you don't need Shema V'Shema, it's obvious that Yachloku But no, because it wouldn't have been obvious because you might have thought the first case was shema v'shem. So by giving you two cases, and we've seen this a lot of times in the Gemara, where they specifically say, oh, they added another one, so you make sure you knew the first one wasn't the same as the second. Okay, and therefore, right, Tana Seifa Shema v'Shema Michlal. From there we infer Deresha bari and Afilu Hachi Yachloku, and even bari Yachloku. So we have two ways to read the first case of the Mishnah. Okay, and then we're going to move on already to the second case. But or maybe yes, yeah, we're moving. Sorry, no, I'd like to start. Oh no, now we have our second question. My mistake. But this was the first question against Rav Huna. Again, we have two understandings of the Mishnah. The first is Raba, who thinks that Sumchus only says it. Everyone thinks the Mishnah is Sumchus. It's just a question is case one bari, and does Sumchus also say Yachloku and bari? That's Rav Huna. Rava thinks it's shema v'shema, and he has to change the wording a little. Shema mishamacharti, shema mishalakachti. Maybe, perhaps, but not definitive. And only in that case will Sumchus say Yachloku. But we have another problem with this. Also, we'll answer it. Tanan. Let's look now at the second case in the Mishnah. Ze omer gadol v'ze omer katan. Okay, each one claims I bought the bigger or the smaller one. Yishava, or I sold the smaller one. Yishava hamochel shekatan machal. In the case where it's bari v'bari, now this is going to be our problem. If Sumchus says bari v'bari, we split it 50-50. What does it say in the last part of the Mishnah? Okay, case 3 of the second half of our Mishnah. It says, if we're both definitive in our claims, Ze omer katan macharti, I know I sold you the small one. And you say, I know I sold you the bigger one. I take a note saying, right, that I sold you the smaller one, and with that, I give you the smaller one. Now, Bishlam al Rava, according to Rava, it's very intuitive because Ki amar Sumchus shema v'shema, v'bari lo amar, and mishum hachi yishava. That's why you take an oath here, because we don't know, right? Because in Sumchus only said Yachloku if neither one is sure in their claim. But if both are sure in their claim, Sumchus doesn't apply, which is why we have a different law, which is we take an oath. Yes, in fact, Sumchus said even in a definitive and definitive case, everyone's clear in their claim. It should have said Yachloku. So now we're going to have to add something else. Okay, this is an interesting daf because we're going to keep coming back to things. Where now the Gemara is going to actually say, as we're going to see further on, which is rare, maybe it's even an addition, this line. As we're going to explain, that's Kedibina Lamemar Kaman, as we're going to explain coming up right now. While Sumchus says in bari v'bari Yachloku, according to Rav Huna, but he doesn't think Yachloku in a case where you're actually obligated to shvua by Torah law. If you're obligated to shvua by Torah law, then we're going to make you take an oath about your claim, your safek claim. Okay. What this oath by Torah law is, we don't know yet. We're going to see in the end, it's a moda b'miktzat case. We're going to have to explain that as we go on. Remember, moda b'miktzat, that's where you admit to part of a claim, but not to the other part. So now, let's just put that issue aside. We've explained both questions against Rav Huna, but we kind of left the last one a little open to understand what shvua d'oraita is here, but that's why it's an exception to the rule, because they're already obligated to shvua by Torah law. Now let's learn this case. Why do you have to take an oath? And that's going to get us to the answer that we just said. So now they're going to say, okay, let's assume like we just did, which is what the Gemara assumes. It's a shvuat moda b'miktzah, which again means I accept, right? I agreed to half your claim, but not to your whole claim. So I'm the seller, right? I agreed that I sold you something, but I agreed that it was small, not large, right? Now, is that moda b'miktzah? So now the Gemara is going to say, for 3 reasons, this is not moda b'miktzah. Because remember the case, it's about a slave and it's about land. So comes the Gemara and says, there's no way there's a moda b'miktzah. Why should you take an oath? Number 1, what is moda b'miktzah? I admit to part of your claim. Now, masha ta'ano, what you claim, a big slave, let's just go with slave, lahodalo, I didn't admit to this slave. You wanted Joe, I was going to give you someone else, right? You wanted this slave. I was giving you a different slave. That's like, and we've seen this before, we're going to see it again today. You claim I owe you wheat, and I say, no, I don't owe you wheat, I owe you barley. Now we're going to see there is one opinion that says that is moda b'miktzah, but generally we think it's not. And masha hodalo lo ta'ano. I say small, you said I didn't want a small eved. So there's no correlation between my claim and your claim. They basically cross it, right? I'm saying one thing, you're saying something else. There's no moda b'miktzah. Number 2, od Helahu. This is Hela. What is Hela? Halach is if, let's say, you claim I owe you 100, and I say I only owe you 50, and here it is. Remember we learned this? If I say, and here it is, there's no oath in that case, okay? Or at least some people say there's no oath. So this question is according to those who say. Now, this is halach. Why is this halach? Well, what is halach? Halach is saying, it's like, here it is. Now, if our claim is about land or slaves are inherently a case of halach. Why? Even if I don't say here it is. Because they can't disappear. They can't be hidden. Now, you could say maybe a slave you could hide. Just reading a book about someone who was hidden and nobody found them. Anyway, but eventually they did. But anyway, you could theoretically hide people, but they're not really easily hidden. Let's just put it that way. So, or, God forbid you think about the hostages right now, right? They're hidden. Nobody knows where they are. But here we have a case where the eved, we assume the eved is in existence and is here. And then the land is always here. It can't be hidden. So all cases of land and slaves are halach, which means, again, according to those who say, you don't take a shvuah in a halach case, this would be a problem. And thirdly, einish bein avadim. We have a principle. You might remember, we learned, Akol bar pesha, al shorach hamor, we had all these drashot on that pasuk. You don't take oaths on land, and you don't take oaths on slaves. So slaves are considered like land, and therefore, right, they're not like movables, or we'll see there's a machloket about it, but right now, they're not like movables. So we have three reasons why it makes no sense to say there's a shvuat moteh b'miktzat here, and that's why you're taking the oath. So if you remember, let's go back for a minute. What did we say? Sumchus admits that when there's a Torah oath, we'll make the guy take an oath. But this isn't a Torah oath. So we're going to have to explain the Gemara in the Mishnah in 4 different ways. Okay? 2 of them we're going to eventually we're going to raise issues with almost all of them, and the end be left with 2 answers. First answer we'll actually be left with, and no one rejects this. Amar Rav, bito ano demei eved gadol, demei eved katan. The Mishnah is not as it seems. It's actually not that you claim it was a big eved and I claim it was a small eved. The case is, now we're going to go with Rashi, although Tosfot doesn't like Rashi, but we'll go with Rashi anyway. Rashi says, the case is where you sent a messenger. It wasn't you and me that are arguing. You sent a messenger to buy you a slave, and you gave the messenger money. And the messenger comes back without the slave. And you say, I want my money back. And now you have an argument. How much money did you give the slave? Did you give the slave money for a big eved, or did you give the slave money for a small eved? And the argument's not between me and you, the koneh and the bocher, even though Tosfot says, what do you mean? The Mishnah talks about it. It's a machloka between the seller and the buyer. But according to Rashi, we have to add in, again, this is an ukimta. This is what we say, the Mishnah is in a unique case where we're not talking about a slave, we're talking about the money for a slave, and then you resolve all the problems because it's moteh b'miktzat, because you say, I gave you $150, and they say you only gave me $100. So they're admitting to part of the claim, 100, and you're saying you owe me more, right? So that's a moteh b'miktzat. It's not halach because they didn't give you the money right away. It's not like a slave or land that it's always considered halach, and it's not a problem if you don't take an oath on slaves. So we've resolved all the issues. Okay, and the same thing with the field. It's the value of the field. You sent someone to buy you a field, and they came back without the field, and you want your money back. Shmuel Amar, betano ksut eved gadol, ksut eved katan. Omrei sadeh gdola, omrei sadeh ktana. It's not money you are arguing about. It's not complicated with a messenger. It's that we have a debate about the clothing for a large eved or small eved, or piles of grains from a big field or piles of grain from a small field, which obviously is going to be a larger amount. And then, again, we're talking about, okay, well, we're going to see which ones this resolves. Okay, it easily resolves halach because it's movables. And it easily resolves einish bein al avadim because the oath is not about avadim, slaves or land. It doesn't exactly resolve the moteh b'miktzat. Maybe with the omarim, yes, because you could say X amount of sheaves versus Y amount, right? X plus 5 amount of sheaves. But ksut, okay, and that's what the Gemara is going to start off with on Amud Bet with the big question. According to you, ksut, mashatano lo hodalo, mashodalo lo tano. But wait, if you're talking about clothing, if you're talking about a big shirt and a small shirt, you're back to square one. That's 2 totally different things. Big shirt, small shirt, it's not like a big shirt is, a small shirt is part of a big shirt. It doesn't work that way. It's more like chitim and solim, right? Of wheat and barley. So they answer that question, Kid Amar of Papa b'delaife, hachanami b'delaife. They say, imagine a quilt. It's done like patchwork. So it's a clothing that's done with patchwork where it's got different parts. And I claim it was a small part of that, and you claim it was a bigger part of that. And then we can have a case where the clothing is moda b'miktzah. So that question we've resolved. However, Rav Hoshaya is going to come with a bigger question that we're not going to be able to resolve. Kashya, and then Rabbi Hoshaya is going to be answer number 3. So this is good when someone raises an issue with the other person, at least they come up with their own answer, right? As opposed to just saying, oh, your ideas are terrible, but doesn't have his own ideas. Kashya le Rabbi Hoshaya. Midi ksut katane, eved katane. Okay, pretty basic question. Well, your explanation, Shmuel, might have, and the way Rav Papa's answer sort of, but might resolve, assuming we can accept Rav Papa that it was patchwork, might resolve all 3 questions. But the Mishnah said it was an eved. It was land. It didn't say it was clothing of an eved. It didn't say it was sheaves in a land, in a field. No. It doesn't make any sense that you could read the Mishnah in your way. Now, even though we know there's Ukim Tod and we do this all the time, but it has to somewhat fit in with the wording of the Mishnah. So, third answer. Amar Rabbi Hoshaya. So he himself said, Kegon, he took Shmuel and he modifies it. Kegon sheta'ano eved biksuto v'sadeh be'omareha. What he says is we're talking about that there's I said I wanted I say I sold you an eved with its clothing. I sold you a field with the sheaves in the field. And I said it was the small one. And you said, what do you mean? You sold me an eved in its clothes, but a big eved with bigger clothes. And you sold me the bigger field with the bigger amount of sheaves. Now, in this case, you resolve the issues because you end up with, right? It's not halach anymore because you have movables. And it's not a problem, Einish ben Alavadin, because you have movables. And if you remember, what's called Gilgul Shvua or Zokakin, we're going to see it in the language Zokakin in a minute, which is if you're already liable to Shvua for part of your claim, then we can make you liable for Shvua for the whole thing. So even though normally you wouldn't take an oath on land or slaves, you can take an oath here because you're already chayav an oath because of the other part. And then the Mishnah works because we're talking about an eved, and what it means an eved with its clothing and a field with its sheaves. But we still have a problem. Akatik suit, we still have the problem that we raised before against Shmuel, although we answered it, but actually, okay, I'll point out one thing. There it said, as Rav Papa answered, and this is where Rav Papa answered it, and we're basically copy and pasting the answer from here back in that case. But the ksut, mashatano, the hodalo, mashodalo, lo tanu. But when it comes to clothing, again, it's 2 totally different claims. That's not a moda b'miktzah. A small shirt is not a part of a big shirt, to which I'm Rav Papa b'delaife. It says yalfe, but they change it to laife. But b'delaife means it was done like patchwork. And then, in other words, they basically come up with a case where ksut would be moda b'miktzah, and now we have, we're set. This is a good answer. However, comes Rav Sheshet, who's then going to come up with his own answer, and has a difficulty with this. Kasha le the Rav Sheshet. Zokakin atadash moinan tanina. Zokakin nechasim she'en lam achrayut and nechasim sheyesh lam achrayut l'shavaleh. Rav Sheshet says, wait a minute. So according to what you're saying, Rav Hoshaya, what's the main thing we're learning from this line in the Mishnah? We're learning that if you have a disagreement about this eved you sold with its clothes, since you have to take an oath on the clothes, we make you take an oath on the eved as well. And that's what the Mishnah is teaching you. But that we already learned in a Mishnah in Kiddushin. We don't need a Mishnah to tell you something we already learned in a different Mishnah. Zokakin, that's what we just said, right? It's trying, Zokakin, you want to teach Zokakin? Gulgul Shvua, in other words? We already learned that in a Mishnah, Zokakin, right? Tanina, we learned it in a Mishnah. Zokakin, I'm just reading again what I read before. Zokakin nechasim she'en lam achrayut. That means things that are not guaranteed, that means movables. They can be zokakin, they can pull kind of thing. Et nechasim sheyesh lam achrayut. They can pull the ones like land and slaves that don't have, that are guaranteed, which you don't generally take an oath about, lishavalehem, to make you take an oath on it. So we don't need this Mishnah to teach you that. Therefore, Rav Sheshet comes up with a total different interpretation. Instead of giving it an ukimta like the other 3 did, Either, let's just review. Demay, we might not have time to review at the end of DAP, so I'm going to try to review as we go. We have Demay Eved. It was the value of an Eved, and it was this Shaliach and the agent. We have the Ksut, it was just clothing or piles of grains. And then we have the clothing with the Eved, the sheaves with the land. Comes Rav Sheshet and says, Hamani Rabbi Meir. We can just simply say this is Rabbi Meir's opinion. Why? Rabbi Meir thinks, we learned this already, that slaves are like movables. They're not considered like land. And that's why you take an oath on the slaves. Okay, but that resolves one issue, which is Ein Nishba'in Alavadim. Okay, the last question we had, but it's still Halach, and it's still not Moda B'Miktzat. If you assume the pshat that we're talking about a big slave and a small slave, well, Akate, still, Mashatano Lohodelo, Mashatano Lo Tanu. You wanted, you claim you bought Joe, and I claim you bought Jane. Those are two different people. And Savarla, so the answer, and I told you this, that there is an opinion that says this, Savarla Rabban Gamliel. You can say that it's like Rabbi Meir, and it's like Rabban Gamliel. Okay, there's a Mishnah that says, if you claim I owe you wheat, and I say no, I owe you barley, that's not Moda B'Miktzah, but Rabban Gamliel thinks it is. So big Eved, small Eved, we could say is Moda B'Miktzah. Okay, and that's how we could explain it. But what about the Halach? Akate Halachu, it's still Halach because it's still a person. Whether you treat it like movables or not, it doesn't matter. It's a person and it's here, and it's as if you said Halach because it can't be hidden, just, kind of made to disappear. Amarava, Avda de Kataliyade, Vesadesha Farber Barot Shechinu Ma'avot. We'll explain that it's a case where you're not returning the actual Eved. Even though I said it was an Eved Katan, I'm going to swear and give you the Eved Katan, but I'm not actually going to give you this Eved Katan because this Eved got its arm cut off. So it's not worth anymore what it was when I sold it to you. So I'm going to have to replace it with a different slave. That already is not a Halach case. Or the field, it got dug in, all sorts of things got dug into it, and now it's not worth what it was before, so I'd have to give you a different field. So we'd have to explain it in that case so that it's not Halach, and then we've resolved the Halach problem. Even though we didn't really do an ukimta, in the end you have to do an ukimta to a certain extent, because otherwise it doesn't make sense. But now we're going to say we have a few problems. Number one, Rabbi Meir, but wait, Rabbi Meir somewhere else is the exact opposite. Okay, let's see. Ditnan. Gazal behema vizkina, avadim vizkinu. You sold an animal, and then the animal got old before you returned it. You stole a slave, and the slave got old and is not worth as much as it was. Mishalem kishadak zela. You pay at the time there, because you acquired it at the time you stole it. Rabbi Meir omer, ba'avadim omer lo haresh shachal fanecha. When it comes to slaves, you just get the slave back, because a slave is like land. If I steal land, it's as if it never left your domain. It's yours. Likewise, the slave. So you get it as it was. The fact that it changed, I didn't acquire it when I stole it because slaves are treated like land. So you see, Rabbi Meir said slaves are like land and not like we said that he thinks slaves are like movables. So they say, okay, that's not a problem at all. Halakasha, kidemachlif Raba Baravua, Vitani, Rabbi Meir, Omer Mishalem Kshav Ksela, Chachamim Omrim, Omer Lo Bavadim Haresh Chalafanecha. He just switches. Who says what? Okay, Rabba Baravua had a switch there. He's the same one, by the way, that kept switching the Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, and the Shomer Sachar, in the Socher. Like a Shomer Sachar, Shomer Chinam. He has a different version of it, and then Rabbi Meir is on the right side, and we're good. Okay, that was a small question. But now we're going to have a bigger question on Rav Sheshet. Elam. Yeah, if you might have noticed, I specifically didn't point this out. But this resolves, if you say Avadim are like movables, then you're good on the slave. But wait a minute. The Mishnah also gave the exact parallel case when it came to land. Now, land, nobody thinks you take an oath on land, right? So that doesn't resolve to say it's like Rabbi Meir doesn't help us with the land case. Why are you taking an oath on land then? There's no moda b'miktzat on land. So now you're going to say, the only way you could explain Rav Sheshet then is to say that Rabbi Meir held slaves are, okay, let's just do like a mathematical equation. Slaves are like movables and you take an oath on them. And then from there, we're going to learn, oh, and by the way, you also take oaths on land. Okay, so that's what they're going to ask him. The Sava Rabbi Meir, Elamimai de Sava Rabbi Meir, Makshina Karka Eved. Where do we get all of a sudden? That might solve the Eved problem. But what? He's going to say, just like Avadim, you take an oath. Now we're going to say, and then land also, you can take an oath. Ma Eved Nishba'in, Af Karka Nishba'in. Right? You're going to say that? just like you take an oath on a slave, you would take an oath on land. Dilma ha'evedu denishbayin aval karka lo. Right? It's likely that Rabbi Meir only thinks, and it's logical also, that the eved is like movable, so the eved you take an oath, but land is like land, so you don't take an oath on that, in which case the Mishnah makes no sense because you're ignoring the second part of that case. So now they say, okay, lo salkadata. What this means is it doesn't seem to be that he only thinks you take an oath on slaves. He actually thinks you take an oath on land, and they're going to try to prove it, but reject it. And in the end, reject Rav Sheshet because of the land part, because the whole land case makes no sense. Definitely, you wouldn't take an oath on land, in which case there's no moda b'miktzat oath, in which case there should be no oath at all. We should go back to Sumchus yachloku, in which case we're going to reject Rav Sheshet's reading. But right now, they're going to try to prove from the language of this Braita that perhaps Rabbi Meir, you can read as saying you take an oath both on slaves and on land. So let's attempt it. Did Tanya. And then, because we already quote this Braita, we're going to have some explanation of something else in the Braita before we finish up. So here reads the Braita. And this is like the first case of our Mishnah. And remember I said in our Mishnah, we didn't get the 4 permutations of bari v'shema. Now we're going to have the 4 permutations in this Braita. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because it's just the 4 cases we've been seeing. Somebody sells, right? We switch the para for the chamor. We sell the slave woman, and the para and the slave woman have an offspring. So case number 1 says it happened in my domain, and the other one doesn't say anything. Zacha, so the one who has the vadai case wins. If neither one knows, they split it 50-50. If they're both definitive in their claims, okay, so now we have exactly like our Mishnah. The seller takes an oath that it was in the seller, right? Because the seller doesn't have to then give the vlad over. Because anyone who takes an oath, any of the Torah oaths, you take an oath to not pay. And the idea is that probably, right, it meant the slave was in the domain of, or even if the slave was in no one's domain, remember, we always go back to the original one where the chazaka was, that was the original owner, and therefore you do this. Now notice what you see here, Divrei Rabbi Meir. You take an oath on a slave. Chachamim omrim, now here's where they get the land, because it wasn't talking about land at all. Chachamim omrim, ein nishba'in lo al avadim v'lo al karkaot. The rabbis say, we disagree with you. How do we disagree with you? Well, no oaths on slaves and no oaths on land. Now, there's 2 ways to read this, obviously. Either Rabbi Meir disagrees with the entire statement of the rabbis, but remember, Meir was only talking about slaves. Maybe he was only disagreeing about the slave part. So let's just read. The fact that the rabbi disagreed with Rabbi Meir and said you don't take oaths on slaves and you don't take oaths on land, Lab Michlal de Rabbi Meir Savar Nishbaim. From here, can't you infer that Rabbi Meir disagrees with Chachamim entirely and thinks you take oaths on slaves and you take oaths on land? And then that would fit perfectly with Rav Sheshet trying to say our Mishnah is Rabbi Meir. But the Gemara says, no, that's not a good proof. Because Mimai, Dilma Kashem Shamru Kamerle. Maybe they meant just like, meaning, Ki Hechi de Odi Lam Bekarka O. Chachamim are saying like this, we know you agree with me about land, but there's no oaths. So if you agree with me about land, wouldn't you also agree with me about slaves? Because slaves are like land. And on that point, Rabbi Meir disagrees with the rabbis. So just like Kihechi, de Odi Lam Bekarka O, that you admitted to me with like land, you agree with me. Odelinami, Odalanami, Bavadim, agree with us also about Avadim, that there's no oaths on Avadim, and that's what the rabbis are saying. But not that Rabbi Meir actually disagrees with land. And in fact, we're going to further prove this, that Rabbi Meir definitely thinks there's no oaths on land, because look, Teda Ditnam, we're going to bring a Mishnah with a machlok Rabbi Meir and the rabbis, and from here it's clear he thinks there's no oaths on land, which is going to make Rav Sheshet's answer obsolete. Rabbi Meir Omer, Yesh dvarim shehem kekarka ve'enan kekarka ve'en chachamim modim. Rabbi Meir and the rabbis have a debate about certain things, that Rabbi Meir thinks there's certain things that are land that we treat not like land, meaning we do take an oath on them, while land we don't take an oath on, but some things that are on land that are attached to the ground, we would. That's what he's saying. There's an exception to the rule, but the rule is we don't take oaths on land, and therefore it's pretty clear. So let's read what the case is. Ba'am Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina, sorry, I skipped. Ketzad, what's the case? Esel kfanim tu'unot masarti. I told you I sold you 10 vines full of, I gave you 10 vines full of grapes. And I gave to you, meaning, and I want them back. And you say, no, there were only 5. Rabbi Meir mechayev, Charamim omrim, kol mechubar lakarka reu kekarka. So since I told you I gave you them full of grapes, I want them back full of grapes, and you admit to 5 of them. So Rabbi Meir says you take an oath, the rabbis say you don't. Amar Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina, what's the machloka between them? We've learned this before. They're talking about a case where they were full of grapes that were ready to be picked. Because they were ready to be picked, even though they're attached to the ground, Rabbi Meir viewed them as if they're detached from the ground already. So Mar Savar Kibitzurot Danya, they're as if they were already picked, and therefore they're metaltalim, they're not land. But what does he obviously say? If they were land, they weren't ready to be picked, or the land itself, obviously, we wouldn't have an oath. Umar Savar Lav Kibitzurot Danya. And therefore, we can't accept Rav Sheshet. Right, the rabbis say they're viewed as if they're attached to the ground because they are attached to the ground. That's their machlok. Anyway, so we can't accept Rav Sheshet that the Mishnah matches Rabbi Meir, because even though we fully explained the slave case, because he thinks slaves are like movable property, and we explained all the issues that came up, not halach because the Eved's missing an arm, and therefore you're not giving back this Eved. But the land, there's no way to explain why you would take an oath on land, and therefore we have to reject it. But interesting, they don't go back to Rav, I don't know why, but they say we can explain it in the end like Rabbi Yoshai, and you said, what about Zokikin? Isn't right? We already learned this in a different Mishnah. You still need it. Why? Because you might have thought that maybe since you're doing the clothing with the Eved, the clothing is on the Eved, and the sheaves are in the land, maybe it would be batel, like no, it's considered really like land. It's not like, right, we have an argument about one thing and another, and one is going to pull the shvu on the other. But this is the clothes on the Eved, maybe it's just considered like an Eved. And the halacha is no, even though the clothes are with the Eved, it doesn't matter. There's clothes, you're obligated shvu on that, we can make you take a shvu on the Eved. So we end up left with Rav, which said it was this case of the value of an Eved, and it was just money they were arguing about, or Rav Hoshaya, it was the Eved with the clothes, the field with the sheaves. Now we're just going back to this line in the Braita. Since we talked about this case of the Shipcha, and we brought up in the Braita, and if each one says we don't know, Yachloku. Hamane, again, who does this go according to? You can already read this by yourself. Sumchus Amar Mamon Mutab Safek Holkin, right? And this is obviously a shema case, nobody knows, right? Ema Seifa, they say, wait a minute. But in the Seifa it says, Zeomer B'Shuti V'Zeomer B'Shuti, Yishava Mocher Sheb'Shuto Yalda. But wait, in that same Braita it says, they have an argument, and we don't say achloku, we say yishava. And the Raba bar Rav Huna da'amar, right? According to Raba, it's very easy. That's bari ubari. Sumchus didn't say in bari v'bari. This is our review of the earlier part of the daf, since we won't have time anyway. So remember, there was that big machloket. Now, the Raba bar Rav Huna da'amar in amar Sumchus afilu bari ubari amay yishava mocher yachloku mebayale. If this is Sumchus, according to Raba bar Rav Huna, it shouldn't be yishava. It should be yachloku. To which you know where the Gemara is going, hopefully, which is Sumchus would have to admit, though, right? Remember, we said that Sumchus agrees in a case where you're already obligated to shvua, which we already explained this case, was when you're obligated to shvua. And this, by the way, goes back to the second question we had on Rabba bar Rav Huna, where we had to say, it's like we learn later on where you're already chayv a shvua. It explained the case in the Mishna and explains this case in the Braita. Why is there a shvua according to Rav Huna when it's bari, we both are definitive? If Sumchus says yachloku, because these cases we view them as a moda b'miktzah. Let's remember, right? By the way, I didn't say here. Why is it moda b'miktzah? Because you're arguing about a shifcha and the vlad. So the guy says, I agree that I sold you the shifcha, but I don't agree about the vlad. So it's also a moda b'miktzah case. So we're going to have moda b'miktzah, but you'd have to explain, like Rava, that it's not halach, because otherwise also there wouldn't be a shvua. So why is it not halach? Because it would have to be a case where the arm was cut off of the slave, and then you don't give the slave, you give something else, and then it's not a halach case. So with that, we kind of keep going around in circles, getting back to things we said before. Now we're on a totally new case in the Mishnah, and we'll read the Mishnah in a small part of the Gemara to finish up the daf. Hamocher zeitav le'etzim. I sold you my olive tree, but not for the fruit, for the wood. Okay, it's probably a bad tree, which we'll see in a minute. And I sold it to you, you're going to chop it and use it as wood. But it's still like the property is mine. But you didn't chop it. Asu pachot mirevi l'seah. You didn't chop it. Olives grew. You took them, you made them into olive oil. And out of a se'ah, a big amount of olives, all you got was less than a revi, which is very little, a quarter of a log. Okay, we assume I gave up on those when I sold you the thing. I didn't want them. They're yours, right? Also, remember, they were bad olives. That's why they didn't make too much. But if a se'ah of those olives turned into a revi, gave you more than a quarter log, or a quarter log at least, now we have an argument, because I say, I want that olive oil. That's from my, right, first of all, it got from the ground. The ground is mine. It got nutrients. Zeomer zeitai gadlu. You say it was the tree, and I bought the tree. And I say, artzi gadla. I say it was my land that helped it grow. I want the olives. So, yachloku. We split it 50-50. Here's a weird case. Shatav, we're going to talk about this a lot more tomorrow. Shatav nahar zeitav. A big river stream came in, picked up my olive tree, dumped it into your territory, and it ended up taking root there, okay, and grew in your field. Nitanam letoch sadeh chavero. Okay, that means it put it in your field, and then it grew olives. So zeomer zeitigadu. I say, look, it's my olive tree, my olives. Zeomer atzigidla. Again, you say it's my nutrients from my ground that grew it. Yachloku. We split it 50-50. So the Gemara first asks, hey chigami, what's the case where I sold you the tree for the wood? If I said, Ida Amar Kotz Alter, I said, chop it down immediately because it's in my land and I don't want my nutrients going to this tree because it's the dead tree anyway. I want it out of my property. I clearly gave up all, I'm sorry. In that case, you didn't listen to me. So it all, even less than the revi, it should all go to me. Ida Amarle, Kol Ema Tabai Kotz. If I said, cut it whenever you want, then afilu revi nami labal zeitin. Then you should get everything because I didn't care. I gave you the tree. So if olives grow, it's yours. The case must be where I didn't specify. And then then the revi becomes the determining factor. When I don't specify what I really wanted with this tree, did I want you to cut it down right away or not? Then we go by if there was a revi, if there wasn't a revi. And then we're just going to finish with this one line. But when we say a revi, now think about what happened. You took my tree, right? You bought the tree. You made the olive oil. And now we're going to say, because I sold it to you really for the wood, and I wasn't clear about what I wanted, if it made a revi, I get the olive oil. But that's only if a se'ah makes a revi after the deductions of your time, all the equipment you needed to do the pressing of the olives. You have expenses. So we deduct the expenses. If there's still a revi left, then I get it. But I can't take away from you, right, all the money you invested in it. So that's our sugya for now. I'm not going to be able to review today, but we'll end here. Wishing everyone a chodesh tov, a Shabbat shalom, and should be a month to bring b'sorot tovot.